I want to thank everyone for braving the weather on this beautiful autumn Saturday. And I want to thank you for coming and what I think is going to be a very, very interesting session as part of our Alumni Weekend under the title of Perspectives on Energy and Our Future. I'm very pleased to host a very distinguished panel of colleagues who are working at the forefront of one of the most important challenges that faces our nation: our ability to secure affordable and clean energy. Our way of life, the future of our planet, depend on developing sustainable energy supplies that power our homes, power our modes of transportation, and that fuel the engine of our economy. For the first time in almost a century, the path toward our energy future is not clear. Fossil fuels, petroleum, natural gas, and coal are no longer the only fuels of our future. And we see our energy supply as needing very significant components of alternative components, including nuclear, wind, solar, regenerative biofuels, and hydroelectric power. The goal of the discussion today is very straightforward: to hear from experts from both government and industry about where we are in our energy future and what options we have going forward. We have an outstanding set of panelists with us this afternoon to accomplish this goal. And it's a pleasure to introduce each of them in order before they talk. The format today will be very simple. Each of our panelists will come up and talk for about 15 minutes, making introductory statements. We will then raise the screen, because you notice the chairs are on the other side of the screen. If they sit there now, it doesn't look real good. We will raise the screen, the panelists will come up, and there will be a moderated discussion with the audience. So let me begin by introducing the participants. First is Steven Koonin. Dr. Koonin is Undersecretary of Science at the U.S. Department of Energy. He was previously Chief Scientist for BP, one of the world's largest independent oil companies, where he was responsible for guiding the company's long-range technology strategy, particularly in alternative and renewable energy sources. As chief scientist, he provided technical advice to the company's senior executives, and he was also responsible for BP's major university research programs around the world. Dr. Koonin joined BP in 2004, following a 29-year career at the California Institute of Technology as a professor of theoretical physics. He joined the Caltech faculty in '75, became a full professor in 1981, and served as provost for 9 years before joining BP. That's an extraordinarily long sentence as provost. I say this looking at David. Dr. Koonin is a fellow of the American Physical Society, the American Association of Advancement of Science, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and has as well as served as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. He served in numerous advisory bodies for the National Science Foundation and the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy as well. His research interests have included theoretical and computational physics as well as global environmental science. I should say he received his bachelor's degree in physics from Caltech and his PhD in theoretical physics from MIT. Let me also introduce the other two speakers now. Thomas M. Connelly Jr. is Executive Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer for the DuPont Corporation. He has responsibility for DuPont's applied biosciences, nutrition and health, performance, polymers and packaging, industrial polymers businesses. He also has responsibility for science and technology efforts in the geographic regions outside the United States, as well as integrated operations overall. He joined the DuPont company in 1977 as a research engineer at the DuPont Experimental Station, their premier research laboratories in Wilmington, Delaware. He's a graduate from Princeton University, where he graduated with highest honors in the very honorable profession of chemical engineering, and also in economics. He was a Winston Churchill Scholar and received his doctorate in chemical engineering from the University of Cambridge. He serves in advisory roles to the U.S. government and the Republic of Singapore. Presently, Dr. Connelly currently co-chairs the National Research Council Committee on Biology in the 21st Century. Our last and very noteworthy participant is Philip Giudice, who is the commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. A geologist and a management professional, he brings more than 30 years of experience in the energy industry to his current position. He has a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of New Hampshire and an MS in economic geology from the University of Arizona, as well as an MBA from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. Prior to joining the Department of Energy Resources, he served as Senior Vice President of Internoc, how do you say it? Internoc, which provides electricity demand management services in businesses and institutions, utilities, and grid operations. He also was a senior partner in Mercer Management Consulting, a global energy utilities practice. He's an executive committee member and treasurer of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and also serves as chair of the governing board of the Massachusetts Renewable Energy Trust. He is a board member of the National Association of the State of Energy Officials, a leadership group member of the National Action Plan for Energy Efficiency, and vice chair of the National Council on Electric Policy. Finally, let me introduce our moderator for this afternoon's session, Andrei Ruckenstein. Andrei Ruckenstein is the Vice President for Research at Boston University. He's also a physicist by training and is Professor of Physics at Boston University as well. Before coming to BU in 2007, Andrei held a faculty position in the physics department at Rutgers University, where he rose quickly through the ranks to professor and director of the interdisciplinary program in quantitative biology. He has held an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship and is co-founder and co-chair of the Aspen Science Center. Now let me begin by asking Dr. Koonin to come and make his remarks.
Providing secure, affordable, and sustainable energy is a major challenge for the country, if not for the world as a whole, and is very much on the minds of those of us in the administration. When I first started learning about energy about 6 years ago, when I joined BP, I used to joke I was the world's highest paid graduate student in that position. It quickly became clear to me that energy was a mystery to many people. And I could, in the course of conversations with folks and my own learning, put together a rather simple story, statement of the problems, an analysis of what the options for response was. And so what I'd like to do for you now is to describe the two problems that are facing our country in energy and tell you a little bit about what the government, we are doing about them, as well as what could be done more generally by other parts of society. The first challenge we have is really one about energy security. It is about providing reliable and economic supply of energy, largely about liquid hydrocarbons for transportation. Think crude oil. The goal that the administration has set is to, within 10 years, reduce our use of oil by 3.5 million barrels a day, or about 25% of what we use every day for transportation. This is an amount equivalent to what we import from the Middle East and Venezuela. The second goal has got to do with greenhouse gas emissions. The conventional use of fossil fuels is filling the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and imperiling the climate. This is mostly about carbon dioxide from stationary sources. Transportation is a relatively small and more expensive place to try to reduce carbon. Most of this is from power and heat. The goal is of order a 20% reduction relative to 2005 within the next decade, and then an 80% reduction of the country's emissions by 2050. So, these two goals are rather significant and will require substantial changes in the ways that we produce, transmit, store, and use energy. In order to meet them, and those going out several decades, we need to identify, develop, and deploy the most cost-effective, material, and available options for dealing with them, and of course, respect the economic progress at the same time. These are not so simple to do. Now, in terms of solutions, most people I know who have seriously studied the problem realize that in the relatively short term, namely within the next 10 to 15 years, there are about 8 or 9 things we need to do in order to address these problems, and I would like to go through that list for you now. And then we'll talk about some of the longer-term issues that we need to deal with. What can we do about transportation? As in all things energy, the first thing you start with is conservation and efficiency. CAFE standards, which should be listed on that bullet but got lopped off in a typo, are a very good thing to be doing. We are raising the mileage standards for new vehicles sold in the U.S. from 27 to 35 miles a gallon within the next 10 years or so. And I would note that that 35 miles a gallon is still significantly below the 42 miles per gallon or so that is common in Europe. I would also note that that's only for new cars. And of course, because cars live 15 years, it takes a long time for these efficiencies to propagate into the fleet. I would also note, in the spirit of telling you how the stimulus money is getting allocated, that some $4 million in stimulus funds, ARRA funds, have been allocated to Massachusetts to help with that problem. The second thing we need to do is to encourage novel vehicle technologies at cost. Most people don't realize that there is substantial technical headroom in the conventional internal combustion engine. There are technologies like HCCI, homogeneous charge compression ignition, variable valve timing, cylinder deactivation, exhaust gas recycling, all of which exist now, are in or close to commercialization status, and can be deployed in a cost-effective way to change the efficiency of the internal combustion engine, perhaps by as much as a third improvement. We can also lightweight the vehicles, of course, as well, and reduce all of the fancy electronics that one might want to hang on vehicles. When I was a kid, the thought of a TV screen in the back seat has just would have blown my mind. All right? Okay. In terms of moving beyond the internal combustion engine, we will see a gradual electrification of transport from internal combustion engine to ordinary hybrids like the Prius, to plug-in hybrids, which are like the Ford product, the Chevy Volt that's supposed to come out next year, all the way to full battery-operated vehicles, the pace of that really being determined by the evolution of battery technologies. And I would just note again that here your government is also at work. There are advanced vehicle technology and battery loan programs that are being actively promulgated by the Department of Energy to try to help with this transition. The second thing we need to do is to work on the fuel side and encourage with consistency a diverse portfolio of unconventional fuels. Biofuels are high on the list, and I think Tom will talk some about these. We need to learn how to take not the starch in corn, but to take the structural material of all sorts of crops, the lignocellulose, and convert it into fuels that are better than ethanol. Right now, ethanol is the largest biofuel that we have. For various reasons, it's not a particularly good biofuel. It has other uses, as some of you may know. But we need to get on beyond ethanol. Algae is another place in which we need an active research program to see whether we can make fuels economically from algae. The government, again, have established renewable fuel standards, and the Department of Energy has established a number of both research centers and demonstration integrated biorefineries to try to move this technology along. Let me turn to heat and power, and again, the first thing here is conservation and efficiency. We need to make the price of electricity evident to the user. If you had a little meter running in the corner of your television screen, you might start to pay attention to what your electric bill would be. You'd certainly get your children to turn off their Xboxes when they were not using them. Efficiency standards, we are actively promulgating improved efficiency standards. $6 million in stimulus money went to Massachusetts for appliance rebates. I was going to say something about efficiency standards. Oh, right. We have, in the Department of Energy, for the first time, issued a subpoena to a company for violating efficiency standards, and that court case will be ongoing, certainly. Regulatory incentives. California has pioneered the way of letting utilities make money by producing less electricity but promoting conservation. And spreading that to other states is a very good thing to do. Buildings. Roughly 40% of the U.S. energy use is in buildings, heat, light, and power. We are actively pursuing weatherization programs, 122 million in this state. Weatherization is a good thing to do for buildings, triple benefit. It puts people to work, it reduces energy use, and it helps poor folks with their energy bills. So you're going to see a lot more of that going on. We have technologies now that can significantly reduce the use in buildings, both new built and existing. It's a question of getting them deployed. And then finally, not so much in the U.S., but in the developing world where cities are being built at a phenomenal rate, worrying about the design of cities for energy efficiency as they get built new, how you move goods, people, the split between residential and commercial and industrial and so on, are all things that can be done to help improve energy efficiency. And then the grid. The U.S. electrical grid has been built up over 100 years as a patchwork of systems run by states or even smaller government entities. We need to learn how to do a better job of storage of energy on the grid, allocation of load and generating capacity one with the other. You know, electricity, you can't store electricity very well. And so on the electrical grid, as the demand comes into being, say through the course of a day, a hot afternoon, you have to turn on more and more generators. And matching the load to the demand in time is a tricky business and can be made much more efficient than we're doing currently. Also, renewables like wind and solar are not present all the time, or not present even when you want them, and so you need to figure out how to manage that intermittency on the grid as well. And there's a loan guarantee that's gone to this state for an energy storage system. So we are trying to do something beyond the research and actually get projects out there. The other thing we need to do about the problem number 2, the greenhouse gas problem, is to set a price on carbon emissions. This is the cap and trade discussion you may have been reading about in the newspapers. That price needs to be significant in order to get people to change. It needs to be long-running, reasonably predictable over several decades, because business will invest in large facilities that will be in existence for several decades and need to be able to recover the costs that are based on carbon having a price. And it also needs to be universal throughout the economy in order to make sure that we capture the maximal efficiency. If and when we manage to set a significant price on carbon, then it's clear that some existing technologies will be favored. The first is natural gas. You may have read in the papers in the last month or so that U.S. natural gas reserves have expanded enormously as a result of our ability to tap into tight gas and shale gas, technologies that were developed in the private sector over the last 20 years or so. Gas is better than coal, which provides roughly 50% of U.S. electricity by about a factor of 2. Onshore wind is now economic relative to gas in many places in the country, and we're going to see a larger deployment of wind. Wind right now provided last year about 1.3% of U.S. electricity. It'll probably get to 20%, say, by 2025 or so. Small and medium hydropower, we have the ability to bring online a significant amount of new hydropower in small streams and at medium scale. Nuclear fission, nuclear power, right now 20% of U.S. electricity. If you put the filter of materiality, economics, and readiness on, this has to be a big part of the future if we're going to reduce our carbon emissions at reasonable economics. And then carbon capture and storage. We are not going to get rid of all those coal plants anytime soon. We need to figure out a way to retrofit them to capture the carbon and put it under the ground and keep it out of the atmosphere. And then finally, portfolio standards, requirements that electrical power be generated by some fraction of renewables, or perhaps even better, low carbon sources are also important. You're seeing those spread throughout the states and perhaps into the federal government as well. and there's been federal money flowing into Massachusetts to help with that. Let me, I'm almost closed, let me talk about this chart a minute, which to me is the most sobering bit of what I will show you. This shows how the U.S. got its energy from various sources over the last 150 years. And you can see at the time of the Civil War, we got most of our energy from wood. And as the Industrial Revolution set in the late 19th and early 20th century, coal became important. The mobility revolution of the early to late 20th century made oil very important. Gas, a wedge kicking in the upper right there in red. Nuclear, an even smaller yellow wedge. And renewables, that little pink slice in the upper right. Those are non-hydro renewables. You can see the hydro there. Those little renewables up on the top are wind, solar, biomass, and so on. And what you can see from this, the good news is that energy technologies change. They change in response to technology developments, in response to economics, and in response to policy. But the bad news is that they change slowly. They change on decadal scales. And just to make that a little more dramatic, I'll show this graph. Take that last decade in the previous chart and open it up and look at the evolution of audio and video technologies during the last decade, and you can see we very quickly went from tapes and CDs to MP3 and flash memory in the course of a decade. Energy is not that. Okay? Energy, the intrinsic thing about energy is, first of all, its scale, longevity of resources. Cars last 15 years, buildings last 50 to 100 years, refineries, chemical plants last a good fraction of a century. The second point about energy change is that energy is ubiquitous, and so lots of people have interests in it. Energy producers, consumers, governments, NGOs, and their interests don't always align, and so things move slowly. They also move slowly in energy because of incumbency. We have already pretty good ways of providing heat, light, and mobility. Any new technologies are going to have to compete on cost and with incumbent interests, and so it all changes very slowly. We need to change the system by orthodonture rather than tooth extraction, okay? And so don't believe that the energy future is going to happen in the next decade or so. It's going to take a long time. For that reason, because energy is different, we need new research models. And we've been trying out in the DOE a number of different mechanisms, energy frontier research centers, some of which are here, I gather, in this university, looking for ways to get at the underlying science. We have a proposal that will be funded this year by Congress to do hubs, which are new ways of integrating the basic science, the transitional research, and the commercial interest together. We have a program in education, both for the energy workforce as well as the energy researchers, and ARPA-E, which is about to disperse money in high-risk transformational research projects, much along the lines of what's been done in the Defense Department. We don't, I think, have optimal models yet for how to effect the transformation of the energy system, but these are all different ways in which we're trying to make that happen more quickly than it would on its own natural timescales. And of course, there are many different federal and state agencies at play here, and they are, perhaps not surprisingly, not as coordinated as you would think from the outside. Finally, I think the last thing we need are technically informed, coherent, and stable government policies. All right? You've seen that long time scale involved in energy. I like to say that a refinery or power plant might last for 40 years. 40 years is 10 administrations and 20 Congresses, right? And we've got to keep the policy sensible and steady over sufficient time to get these things developed and deployed. That means we need educated decision makers and an educated public to let them make the decisions. And universities have a particular role here, both in educating the general public and also providing credible voices in analyzing technologies and policies. We need to focus for the next several decades on the most material and lowest cost measures. In the short term, avoid picking winners and losers and putting a level playing field on for all of the applicable technologies. and for longer term, support for pre-competitive research. High on my list would be methane hydrates, fusion, advanced fission, advanced solar, advanced biofuels, and energy storage are all things we need to be working on as we start to move them into demonstration and deployment. And with that, thanks for your attention, and I'll look forward to the discussion after the other speakers have had a chance.
Good afternoon. We'll go to the next presentation. And I'm Phil Giudice, Commissioner at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. As Bob indicated, my background is 30 years in the energy industry. And in January of 2007, I got a call from the team that was coming together to form under Governor Patrick to help move some of this agenda forward. And I was asked to potentially join the team. And I explained to them that it was impossible for me in my circumstances. I had been 4 years with a company called Enternoc, which was innovating a new business model, and we had filed our papers to go public, and I was a board member, an early investor, and one of the officers there. And so I said I had to stay focused on what I was doing because that was the priority, but I'd be glad to come in and chat with them about other candidates. Come about March, we did actually go public. It was a very successful public offering, and I got a call on the day on the trading floor at Credit Suisse from Governor Patrick's office that said, you can't use that as an excuse anymore. We still would like you to come in. And so I thought about it over the weekend and talked it over with the family and decided to take a ride on trying to help make a difference on these matters. I have been 30 years in the energy industry, and I would describe public policy over that length of time as characterized by a decade of complacency, punctuated by moments of panic, and then as quickly as possible, we like to fall into complacency again about these issues. And that relates to oil's price spikes, that relates to blackouts, that relates to all kinds of things that any of us who are in this industry, from a public policy standpoint, nonprofits, for private sector, know are coming. As Steve was indicating, these changes happen slow in this industry worldwide for all kinds of reasons. The assets don't turn over real quickly, and so we know the implications of what the decisions we're making from an energy standpoint, and we've been making the wrong decisions time and time again for too long. And right now, I think both in this state and for that matter on the nation and the world, it's a most remarkable time to be dealing with our energy circumstances because it is more widely understood that decisions that we have been making need to change and we need to start adopting new ones. And Massachusetts is doing anything and everything we can to, in fact, make changes around our energy circumstances. We adopted a mission. I joined in July and 2007, and right away we adopted a mission that was all about a cleaner, greener energy environment, and it's both environmentally and economically a greener energy circumstance. First and foremost, reduce all the energy waste that's happening in our state at every circumstance of our current energy decisions. Second, get as green of a supply of energy as we possibly can, recognizing that under current economic structures, green energy is more expensive than conventional sources of energy. Nonetheless, we do have some funds available, and we've got to really maximize the development of what we can with the funds available. Third, we need to assure my responsibilities include the safe and reliable supply of energy in the Commonwealth, and so we need to make sure that our energy infrastructure is in fact enabling to do that. And then fourth, and very important, is to grow clean energy jobs. And we're working hard on all of these matters every day in our agency and across the administration, and we're open to anybody and anybody's better suggestions on how we can do more, faster, easier in making this happen. Some of the circumstances in Massachusetts' energy situation are both, it's sort of on the one hand and on the other hand, and one aspect of it is our electricity prices. And this chart shows the average retail electricity price in Massachusetts as it compares to every other state in the country. And as you see, we are the third or fourth highest price electricity in the country. And so that actually is a negative when we have to pay our bills every month, but it's actually a really significant positive when it comes time to looking at alternatives, both in terms of efficiency and in terms of greener energy sources. They will likely make sense in Massachusetts more quickly and more significantly than almost anywhere else in the country. And in fact, one of the aspects of having high energy prices is we have grown an economy. This chart shows on the vertical scale how many dollars of GSP, gross state product, we're producing for every million BTUs of energy we're consuming. And as you can see, we have been growing at a faster rate in terms of being more frugal with our energy expenditures, our energy consumption, in terms of turning out GSP than almost any other state, and a notch higher than California, and at a much more rapid pace. This is, we're about twice the growth as it compares to, or the ability, our GSP, twice as frugal on energy consumption as the national average. And we're also one of the most energy efficient states in terms of per capita. I think we're the third most energy efficient state, which is really a little bit remarkable when you think about our climate here that we have to deal with. But it's not completely surprising considering we're rational people and we've got very expensive energy. So we're using a little bit of energy and making as much as we possibly can out of it as it appears. But in fact, we're still wasting enormous amounts, and we're going to get even better on each of these dimensions. Another factor that's really important as we're thinking about energy policies is how unknown the price of the commodity is. And this chart plots in a black line down in the bottom here and goes up there the price of natural gas, average price of natural gas each year as published by the Energy Information Agency administration inside of DOE. And it also plots their forecast of natural gas in each year that they forecasted it. And you see that they, whatever it was, 1985, they were plotting significant growth in natural gas prices. They actually came down and stayed down for years and years and years as they were continuing to imply much more expensive. And then somewhere down in the 90s, mid-90s, the picture changed. They started forecasting flat natural gas prices, and natural gas prices actually went up significantly. Prior administrators of this agency, I remember having this conversation with, and he said, you mean if I bet against my forecast every year, I would have made a lot of money in the markets? And the reality, of course, is yes. But unfortunately, this sometimes factors into very short-term thinking about our energy circumstances. And we sort of look at today's price on the gas pump or our electric bill, and we say, okay, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And that's simply not intelligent policymaking or decision-making on all of our behalfs. So our electricity prices are high. $105 a month is the average consumption for a residential electricity consumer. About $60 of that, $64 of that is going to pay for the commodity, the generation. About $6 of that is going into transmission, and then $35 of that $105 is going into our distribution charges. $1.50 out of that $105 is being collected and being used for efficiency and renewables in the state of Massachusetts. A very thin slice of money, but in fact much higher than most parts of the country in terms of having a dedicated charge related to renewables and efficiency. This was sort of the old picture, 2008 and previously. We've now adopted new legislation and new policies to really move ourselves forward as fast as we possibly can. And Governor Patrick really sees this as one of the core issues, not just for our state, obviously, but for the planet in terms of dealing with. And he has undertaken, in my mind, every lever that he can pull in terms of the executive branch as well as working with the legislature to really put forth policies and practices on every element of our energy picture we possibly can. Under the executive branch, we've adopted a leading by example program that is going to drive, it is in the process of driving our energy consumption down in all state buildings by 35%. I think the date is 2015, and we're well on the way of meeting that goal. We're just now putting together an over $200 million capital investment program that's going to be funded entirely from energy savings off the balance sheet of the state and off the balance sheet of private sector to really drive our energy consumption down in our state buildings. We have decoupled akin to California's, so that the utilities are no longer sort of incented every time that kilowatt-hour sales goes up. They're actually held harmless with kilowatt-hour sales. They're allowed to recover prudent costs to match their prudent expenses, and that's it. And then we have incentives in place for efficiency and other programs, which have been in place for a while. Governor Patrick, I think it was about day 10 in the office, joined back onto the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. As Bob indicated, I'm the treasurer and I'm on the executive committee there, which is the first cap and trade for carbon in the world where virtually all of the allowances have been auctioned off through that auction process And the vast majority of them, virtually all of them in Massachusetts, are being invested back in energy efficiency so we can really ramp up our energy efficiency activities. And we've now had 5 successful auctions of carbon, and Chairman Markey and Senator Kerry have both remarked to me that this has been very helpful for them as they're trying to push forward a new legislation, a new framework for the government to build off of the cap and trade success. We've set some very grand goals out for PV and wind on the renewable side, and we've got some good progress on that. We formed a Zero Net Energy Buildings Task Force that has come out with very interesting recommendations where we will be now moving towards a 2030 commitment. All new construction, residential, will be zero net energy. And right now we have, I think it's 25 homes in Massachusetts that are built as zero net energy, literally produce more energy than they consume on site, and very livable homes at that. As well as we've got on the street right now 2 solicitations for 2 new buildings for state facilities, significant office buildings, headquarters for our Fish and Game, and I can't remember the other one, that will be zero net energy building from the state standpoint. Launched a Governor's Energy Challenge, have over 100 companies that have now joined with the Governor's Energy Challenge to drive their energy consumption down by at least 10% over the next 2 years, and are taking steps to make that happen. And we, for the first time, have put in our environmental permitting requirements for every significant project in the state that has to come in front of the state environmental permitting. They have to do an inventory and a mitigation plan on greenhouse gases for what they do, as well as a very significant numbers of new legislation, green jobs, clean biofuels, oceans management, green communities, and a Global Warming Solutions Act that I'll touch on a little bit as we go forward. Emissions in Massachusetts are very unusual in the context of the national picture. Our greenhouse gas emissions have been relatively flat since 1990. We've been growing our economy, but we've held our emissions flat largely through 2 things: efficiency and moving out of oil for firing our power plants to firing our power plants more with natural gas, which has better emissions levels. But a big part of it has been efficiency. We are one of the few states, I think there's 4 or 5, that have mandated greenhouse gas emissions requirements. By 2050, our emissions will be 80% less than they are currently, and by 2020, they will be between 15 and 25% less. We're in a process right now to define exactly what that benchmark is for us, but we're moving forward very seriously with reduced greenhouse gas emissions. One of the elements is our renewable projects that have been developed in the state. And we were one of the first states to put a renewable portfolio standard. And unlike some of the states that have standards which have only been met by alternative compliance payments or been falling short of the actual meeting the goals, in fact, our renewable portfolio standard, which is that top line there that's required, is being met now entirely with new renewable projects that are being built either in the state, in the New England region, or in the neighboring control areas according to our rules and regulations. It used to be we're growing our standard by 0.5% a year, but with our success and with the commitment from our legislature, we will now be growing it 1% a year. And within the state, we've really took some of those resources and got going on things like solar development. We're not a particularly sunny state as it compares to some, though we're a lot sunnier than Germany, and Germany is the #1 solar market in the world. And consequently, we took some of the funds that were available, both from earlier alternative compliance payments and the stream of renewables funds that come every month from our ratepayers, and have invested it in a solar rebate program that has been phenomenally successful. The chart on the bottom shows the growth of solar, where we were at 2 or 3 or 4 megawatts of solar before Governor Patrick took office. By the end of this year, we expect to have an installed base of 16 megawatts, a quadrupling of solar in the state, and we expect to be contracted for 50 megawatts of solar by the end of this year. That will be in construction next year, and all of it will be online next year, as we expect. And we're transitioning from what was this rebate model structure to a market structure for the ongoing growth of the solar market that we see that we'll be able to reach our 250 megawatt goal. Wind is another important resource. We don't have wind resources, at least onshore, like Texas or the Northern Plains, but we have some significant wind resources. We put a 2,000 megawatt goal out there for 2020. A lot of that is going to be met with offshore wind. This chart on the top left here shows where those strong wind resources are, and you can see those coastal waters and both federal and state. There's some very significant wind resources, and we've got to do everything we can to get those developed and get them into the market because they'll have a significant impact. But onshore, we're actually also seeing very significant growth. I think there was 4 or 5 turbines spinning before Governor Patrick took office, and by the end of this year, we'll have a couple of dozen, and we have in construction or in final stages expect to have over 70 megawatts of turbines spinning in Massachusetts by the end of next year. So pretty good growth on the wind side. But efficiency is the first and foremost of our focus. In Massachusetts, we've been doing efficiency projects for over 30 years, continuously from the utilities. It's been really quite successful programs, but it was always limited at that $1.25 that was being collected every month from a ratepayer. Literally a quarter of a penny for every kilowatt hour sold was being collected. And we could calculate that we're getting the equivalent electricity from those efficiency programs at about 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour, while we were in the market for our utilities buying from the wholesale market at 7, 8, sometimes 12 and 14 cents. This was nuts. Somehow we were letting the most cost-effective resource not fill up all the needs that made sense, and we were going to the wholesale market under that model. With the Green Communities Act, that has stopped, and we've now got programs that we're putting in place and just now coming out with that will actually drive our energy consumption down. We had been sort of leveling off our energy consumption with those programs, and that's the dark blue is the actual energy consumption that we have, and then the efficiency programs are the slices that are layering on top of it. And these programs will start driving our energy consumption down, and it's quite exciting changes here. One of the resources that New England has been, and Massachusetts is a part of, have been most successful at, and that was what my last company was involved with, is this thing called demand response services. So less than 1% of the hours, we had been building power plants to meet the load at that less than 1% of the hours. Literally 15% of the power plants were out there sitting idle 99% of the time, but they needed to be there because we couldn't tap into the ability of end users to actually drop their demand. And this was nuts, actually. And with new technologies, the internet and other technologies to be able to enable it, we've been growing our non-generation resource to meet our peak electric demands massively. It was about 500 megawatts in 2005, and it's about 2,500 megawatts at this stage, and it's going to continue to grow from there. So instead of having to build and then turn on power plants for a very few hours a year, we can actually send a signal to large users to drop their load for those few hours a year and share with them the economic difference of not having to build power plants. And New England has been one of the first regions to really capitalize on this. There's big debates around the world about how much energy efficiency is possible. And we are looking at our economy without the programs we had would have been growing at about 2% a year to meet our energy needs. The programs we had were getting us at about that 0.2%. So in the past, with the limited money that we had, we were getting significant flattening of that demand. But we're moving towards a world that we expect to be incrementally every year saving between 2 and 3% of the prior year's energy consumption with these new programs, which will start significantly driving our energy consumption down while we continue to grow our economy. And one of the ways is simply we're going to touch a whole lot more people. The programs in the past were saving on the order of 400,000 megawatt hours a year, and we're going to be moving it up to 1.2 million megawatt hours a year. About $5 million in benefits from these new $1 billion in benefits from these new programs for a cost of about 1.4. So from a societal standpoint, we'll be delivering $3.6 billion of economic benefits from them. And we'll be moving from a world where we were touching between 15 and 20,000 homes a year. So we got 2.4 million homes a year. Our old program was touching literally 20,000 of them. It would have taken 120 years to touch all the homes in the state. Over these next couple of years, we're ramping that up to 60,000 homes a year, and we expect to ramp it up substantially beyond that. An average homeowner who's spending about $2,800 a year on energy, electric and gas, we project will be down to $2,100 a year that are participating in these programs, so significant savings. And it's not magic, and it's not all about new technology. It's literally building our homes and rebuilding our homes so that they don't leak the heat and cool air that we have inside of them. So I am quite optimistic about our energy future. I think that we've got a lot of levers that are ready to pull and that we're pulling them as hard as we possibly can. But we certainly need to continue to sort of move faster, do this at as big a scale as we possibly can, and we need to pull these policy levers in coordination, especially between states and the federal government. I see a lot of disconnects in some of the policies that are going on. It's not a one-size-fits-all. There's no magic bullets to any of this stuff, but there are lots of opportunities to kind of work together collaboratively amongst regions and amongst us all to really deliver the solutions that I think are going to have lasting impact for us all. So I'm quite excited about the possibilities, and I thank you for your interest.
Hello, I'm Tom Connelly from the DuPont company. I'd like to begin by thanking President Brown for the invitation to share the panel with my distinguished panelists and to give the perspectives of a public company on the energy questions that have been raised so far today. I'd like to start with just a few perhaps obvious messages, but one is one that has been really covered by our previous two speakers, and that is changes are afoot. The way we derive our energy and use energy will be changing in the years ahead. I'll try to give you a few examples of that. Conservation is the most important place to start. We've heard that from both of the speakers representing government. It will be a key part of our energy future. Secondly, I believe industry, private industry, does have a role to play in this. I will give perspectives from the DuPont company because that's where my experience is, but I'd like to point out that many other companies, large and small, are pursuing opportunities, similar strategies in some cases to those that I'll be describing today. And finally, that in order to solve a problem that is as massive as supplying the world and the nation's energy, the cooperation of universities, of industry, and government are absolutely necessary, and I'll make the case for that in my comments. So by way of getting started, let me move on to this chart. Some statistics on energy consumption today. This looks at world energy consumption over a period from 1990 through forward to 2030. You can see that energy consumption doubles during that time. The U.S. consumption increases by about 50%, and you can see India and China increased by a factor of 6 during that time period. Not surprising, this isn't picking on India or China. Those are very typical of the developing economies. Those are the largest developing economies, and as those countries and others seek to have a standard of life that approaches that in the developing world, their requirements for energy are growing very dramatically, have been for the last 20 years, and will continue to do so. This is total energy requirements, transportation, fuels, industrial needs, and electricity generation. If we look only at electricity generation, and this is on a somewhat different scale from 2006 going forward to 2030, you can see that requirements for electricity will increase by over 50% during that time. Shown here are not the countries, but the sources of energy. And I think this makes Secretary Koonin's point very clearly that although we're talking about the impact that we can have through renewable energy, these take place on a time scale of decades. You can see that today coal represents 41% of our electricity generation, and for all efforts around renewables, it will be 43% 30 years hence. Again, these are global numbers and not just U.S. numbers. Natural gas from 20% to 21%. Renewables are increasing. The biggest piece is hydroelectric, but goes from 19 to 21%. And those increases are really coming at the expense of nuclear, which drops from 15 to 12%. Nuclear has to play an important part in our energy future, but given the fact that either in this country or elsewhere, new nuclear power stations are not being built, that nuclear component will decline before it starts to increase again over the time scale the next couple decades. So just to give you a little bit of background, certainly this is an enormous market. Meeting the energy needs of the country or the world are a huge challenge. But how does a company line up against those challenges? So this is a perspective from my own company on how we approach it. I liked Secretary Koonin's world about a secure, safe, and affordable and sustainable, okay? That's really what we're talking about, secure, affordable, and sustainable energy. The strategies for pursuing that start with conservation, alternative energy, improved efficiency around storage and distribution, and something we won't be talking about today is we're interested in energy needs, but we also have needs for materials that can be met in a renewable way. But today I have time only to talk on a couple of the specific strategies that we're pursuing around alternative energies, those being photovoltaics and biofuels. So let's start with photovoltaics. We're all familiar with photovoltaics or PV panels.
sunlight shines on them, the panel collects that sunlight and converts somewhere between 10 and 15% of the sunlight directly into electricity. In the laboratory, we can get numbers close to 20%, but in commercial units, usually 10 to 15% of the energy. Those panels are expensive. It's more expensive than getting energy from fossil fuels at the moment. And but the attractive part about solar power is once you've bought the panel, the sunlight is free. It doesn't work too well on a day like today in Boston or at night, but by and large, the fixed costs are all experienced at the beginning, and then for the next 30, 35 years, you can collect the sunlight and generate your electricity. This is a chart that shows the relative costs in a cartoon sort of fashion of PV power, shown in the band of the green lines, and fossil fuel-derived electricity, shown in the red lines. And what it says is that the cost of PV photovoltaics is coming down. It's coming down because we're operating at a larger scale as the industry ramps up. It's coming down because the technology is getting better, those efficiencies are going up. And it's coming down because of incentives such as the America Recovery Act, such as similar incentives from other countries that are actually allowing the net cost to the consumer of PV power to come down. You can see at the same time that the cost of, we saw a wonderful chart on natural gas and the fact that over time fossil fuel-based prices are going up. We add to that a carbon tax or a cap-and-trade type system that is going to be superposed on fossil-derived electricity, and we know that those costs are going up. And somewhere in between, and I think that will be really in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see grid parity achieved. And at this point, the cost of solar power is going to be equivalent, and the rate of adoption of solar power will take off. Arguable that that's already occurred in the state of Hawaii, which was on Commissioner Giudice's chart as the first state to go, and perhaps New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts will be amongst the next to follow. So this is a situation we're facing in PV power. Let me talk a little bit about what the technology looks like. You can see here the familiar PV discs chopped from a silicon billet. Much like it was used in the integrated circuit industry, we print conductors on those discs and we lay them out in a module, and you produce a panel such as this. It generates, probably has an efficiency about 15% and generates about 200 watts worth of power. These are the so-called crystalline silicon modules. What's coming along more recently and is just starting to take off is the amorphous silicon thin film technology. Instead of having silicon wafers, we use thin film technology to lay down 100 nanometer layers of amorphous silicon or other semiconducting materials. The efficiency of these units, at least today, is not as good as what we can get with crystalline silicon, but the cost of the process is less. So a comparable size module may only generate 120 watts of power, but at a lower cost point. So these are the two technologies that are being practiced. We as a company sell the materials shown in yellow. We are not a producer of crystalline silicon modules, but we produce many of the materials that go into it. This market is growing about 40% a year. Even in a bad year like we're experiencing the global economy, double-digit increases are occurring in the adoptions of PV technology. We have taken steps in the area of thin film technology to commercialize our first technology. We established a venture called, perhaps not too original, but DuPont Apollo. It's a venture that's headquartered in Hong Kong and China. We've had great support from the Hong Kong government and the Pearl River Delta community across the border in Shenzhen. Our laboratory and headquarters opened in March of this year, and in September, just last month, we started shipping our first thin film PV panels from our fab in southern China. So fast-growing market, and this is the first thin film capacity that's in production in China. Let me change gears here and talk about my second and final subject, and that is biofuels, liquid transportation fuels. And I think Secretary Koonin has teed this up very well. The challenge given to us by the energy bill is to produce by 2022 about 25% over 30 billion gallons of our liquid transportation fuel coming from renewable sources. There are significant economic challenges and technical challenges associated with achieving that goal. Some of the market challenges around the price of oil is volatile. We have to worry about regulatory policy and constancy in a regulatory policy to allow this to develop. And on the technical side, we need to get costs for biofuels that are comparable to what you can get from gasoline, and we need plants, affordable costs for building the plants to make that biofuels. Good news is that progress is being made. That was the situation in the U.S. We say the same thing around the world as virtually every region of the world adopts a policy with regard to biofuels, and we see, again, very strong growth rate over the next decade in biofuels consumption around the world. So there is clear market need there. What has our response been? We've looked at this in two respects. One is looking at the feedstock material. As Secretary Koonin pointed out, we need to move from starch, from grain such as corn, to alternative sources of carbon as the source of the feedstock for biofuels. The second point is we can move now using modern biology beyond ethanol as the only fuel that can be produced. So those are the two programs that I'll describe. First, our work on alternative feedstocks, alternatives to grain. Secondly, our work on advanced biofuels. And with regard to cellulose-based biofuels, as can be seen in the next chart, a complex pattern. Today, people take grain, deliver it to an ethanol plant. The ethanol is derived from corn using the same sour mesh process that's been used for hundreds of years for other purposes. Today, we're talking about changing agricultural patterns to begin to harvest other material, cellulosic material that can be used to produce fuel. So we have to talk about cultivating a separate crop, harvesting it, transporting it, storing it, and then converting it into the fuel. All of this is being done. We need to essentially deliver cellulose material at a cost of $50 a ton to the plant in order to have any chance of hitting the economics we want. That looks like it's achievable for things such as corn stover, byproducts from corn, which is one of our targets. The other target we have is switchgrass. We saw a beautiful photograph of 12-foot-high switchgrass, a perennial grass native to America that will be regrown as a fuel crop in the decades ahead. Let me talk a little bit about what we're doing on the actual process to produce it. Now, I want to work a little data into the talk, and this is actual results from a fermentation process. Now, I talked about that sour mash process where we take that good starch from the grain and convert that using yeast into ethanol. Unfortunately, when we start with cellulose, instead of having that nice glucose that we can get from starch, we have a mixture of glucose and xylose. These are 5-carbon sugars. They're not as good. Our bug, we'll call them Zymo for short. Zymo natively does not like to eat that 5-carbon sugar, but we've reprogrammed him genetically so that he will eat both the glucose as well as the xylose. So, you know, he eats his dessert before he eats the greens, but at the end of the day, he eats both of them and converts them quantitatively into ethanol, which is our desired product. The economics for this process are very encouraging. We're building and starting up in the month of December a 100,000 gallon per year plant in Tennessee with the support of the University of Tennessee and the Tennessee government to demonstrate this technology. The other project I just want to touch on for a second is we're producing ethanol from cellulose in the prior project. In this one, we're taking glucose into a new molecule, and in this case, it's butanol. It's a project that Secretary Koonin was familiar with from BP, as he was one of the people instrumental in helping us get that program going at the time. So wild-type organisms will take glucose to a mixture of acetone, butanol, and ethanol, but we're in the process of reprogramming organisms so they'll take glucose, take it only to butanol. Why do we want butanol? It has higher energy density than ethanol. So if you get 30 miles to the gallon on gasoline, you only get 20 miles to the gallon on ethanol. You'll get at least half of that difference back if we move to butanol. It's easy to blend. Right now you hear about E10 in gasoline. If you use butanol, you'll get at least to E16 or B16 and perhaps higher. And finally, it's just an easier product to deal with. It does not pick up moisture. So I think I've reached my allotted time, so let me conclude with just a couple comments. We have a strong belief in the future that biofuels will have the renewable energy standard, renewable fuel standard can and will be met. We can do that in a way that we do not compete with the food supply as we move from grain to other sources of carbon for production of fuel. And as Sheikh Yamani famously commented and accurately commented decades ago, the Stone Age didn't end for lack of stone. And he went on to say that the oil age will end not when we run out of oil, but when we find better ways to meet our energy needs. I think we are really on the cusp of achieving that. In order to do that, though, I'll come back to the point I started with. Industry works very well when the technology risk and the market risk are relatively moderate to low. But for a challenge as big and as broad as this, the full work of industry, government, and universities are needed, hence the value of panels such as we're having today. Thank you very much.
I want to add my thanks and appreciation to our distinguished panelists for their insightful and far-reaching presentations. We are very pleased that you were able to take the time from your extremely busy schedules to be here with us. We have about 30 minutes for questions from the audience, and you can address your questions either to one panelist or to all the panelists. Please raise your hand for a microphone, and please give your name and affiliation. And also, since the session is being recorded, please use a microphone, and also make sure you turn off your cell phones. So let me use the power I've been vested with in controlling the microphone to ask a first question. And this is a question to the entire panel, since both Steven and Tom talked about biofuels, and I know that there is a great deal of interest in the state of Massachusetts in biomass, and a great deal of research in biofuels at various universities around the state. And everybody's trying to do this right. I'm wondering, how well do we understand the carbon cycle to be confident that we can disentangle the climate effects connected with land use issues and, let's say, man-modified agricultural processes that would obviously have to be involved in the scalability and sustainability of biofuels as a low-carbon energy source? Goes to all of you. Steve, you might want to try.
So let me start with the physicist perspective first. Whole system, big numbers. Every year, about 120 billion tons of carbon are pulled down from the atmosphere to grow plants on the land, and then just about an equal number go back up. It's almost in perfect equilibrium every year. It's a smaller amount, roughly 40% of that goes up and down between the ocean and the atmosphere every year. Our total use of oil for transportation is about 2 billion tons of carbon, or about a perturbation of 1.5% on that flux. As a physicist, I would think that we can tap into that flux for a significant fraction of our 2 billion tons without much perturbation. And the question is understanding how to do it in a sustainable way.
From a Massachusetts perspective, we actually have a Clean Biofuels Act that requires my agency to determine that the fuels that we might qualify to fulfill the requirements of this act are 50% better GHG than conventional fuels. And both from direct and indirect land use needs to be considered by mandate in that act. We assumed that when that act was passed in 2008, that California and the Air Resources Board would put forth protocols to be able to determine that, because they'd been working on it for a number of years and have 50 or 100 people on that one task to determine the GHG footprint, direct and indirect, of biofuels. We also assumed that the EPA, because it's a mandate by January 1, 2010, in terms of renewable fuel standards that the EPA needs to promulgate, and they need to consider indirect land use in that, would also be advancing on that. And we were surprised to find out that neither of those agencies have been successful to date in putting forth mechanisms to actually do the accounting in a way that is acceptable to industry, to sort of the public policy. And that was one of the reasons we actually put off or created for the first year of compliance of the mandate of this act is what we call an early action year. It's similar to what we did in the Renewable Portfolio Standard, where entities that want to participate in this market, if they can demonstrate that they're 50% better GHGs, they can put forth that and get economic benefits for doing that. But from a policy standpoint and an implementer of policy, it is very difficult. We have, in other pieces of this act, actually put in place sort of a blanket override for cellulosic fuels. And in fact, Massachusetts is the only state in the country where there is no tax on any commercial cellulosic fuel that is put forth in our marketplace. So it gives sort of an immediate and ongoing sustainable incentive for companies to bring forth cellulosic fuels in Massachusetts. But there's no fuels available at this time. So we're working it very hard and hoping that EPA and or California or other agencies around the world might put forth protocols that are going to be acceptable, but we're not there yet from my standpoint.
Yep. I think behind the question was the concern about indirect land use. Are we adequately accounting for this as we get into biofuels? I think that the quality and consistency of those calculations is improving over time. The thought here is that if we're using grain for biofuels somewhere else, someone has to cultivate more land to replace that grain. It could be in this country, it could be in Brazil, in order to replace it. There's validity in that kind of argument. I think moving to forestry byproducts, to agricultural residues, to cellulose-based materials that come from non-traditional farmlands are ways to achieve the greenhouse gas reductions without those concerns about land use. I will say, if we really get caught up in the land use arguments, we'd all be eating vegetable protein instead of animal protein, because animals are a very inefficient way to take high-quality vegetable protein and turn it into another animal source. You wouldn't want to see the indirect land use calculations associated with that process, I don't think.
So just one further comment. You know, there are, as I've tried to mention, there are two problems: security of supply and greenhouse gases. You might do biofuels in order to solve or at least address the security of supply problem. It doesn't have to be greenhouse perfect, right? You would address security of supply even if the biofuels were no worse than fossil fuels.
We have a question over here.
Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Martin Idelson. I'd like to address the fusion energy situation. I'm aware of many of the huge problems involved in attaining fusion energy. I understand several billions, or maybe $10 billion, has been appropriated over, maybe 10 years to do an experiment. Is that correct?
So there are two varieties of fusion. I assume you're talking about magnetic fusion and the ITER project, which is a large international project. Is that correct? Or are you talking about laser fusion?
It's tokamak?
Tokamak, correct.
Yeah.
That's a $10 billion project, of which the U.S. is about a 10% participant.
Yeah. Now, my question is, the Manhattan Project was conducted 50 years ago, 60 years ago, which was a huge project to do things that had never been done before, and the same kind of a thing is present in this project. Do you think that the government would want to embark on a Manhattan Project to speed this up to something faster than 10 years to do an experiment?
You know, I personally am dismayed at the pace of fusion research itself. Let me talk about the tokamak, and then I'll talk about the laser bit in a minute, and then I'll say something about Manhattan Project analogies. The ITER project involves of order a dozen nations: the EU, China, Korea, Japan, US, Russia. It has a large management structure. It's trying to do something that has never been done before. If successful, it will demonstrate a burning plasma probably mid-2020s. And after that, we have to start to build the first demonstration power plant, okay? So this is a long pull. Laser fusion, which is just being attempted at a large facility at Livermore in California, the National Ignition Facility. With some good fortune, you might see ignition in a few years, scientific proof of principle, and then a decade to 15 years for something approaching a demonstration power plant. So these are not going to happen overnight. More money would help, but there are many demands in the federal budget, and there are other ways that we can be getting low-emission energy, fission in particular, with proven technologies right now. And then finally, Manhattan Project analogies. The Manhattan Project was done in secret. It had one customer. Energy has the whole society as customers. It had an effectively unlimited budget, and it tried to create a capability that didn't exist before. As I mentioned, we already have pretty good ways of getting heat, light, and mobility. All right, so the Manhattan Project, yes, a big multidisciplinary push by the countries or the world's best technical people, sure, but in other dimensions, the analogy really is false.
And the Manhattan Project was a circumstance where our lives depended on it. And we recognize that at a policy level. Clearly, our lives depend on success on our energy circumstances, but we don't recognize it as a societal level or a policy level in anything more than a few pockets of conversations from my standpoint.
Question, the follow-up on that one is, and it's for all the comment, but I'm really interested in what Steve has to say as well, is that when you think about fission technology, and your graph that shows going out to 2030, fission actually decreasing. You talk about, it was Tom, sorry, showing that the gains in renewables coming at the expense. And yet the technology having such a large capacity to generate electricity. Yeah. Is it going to take a new generation of reactor technology before we can turn that curve up? Before, from a political perspective, the curve will turn up in this country?
Projections of the sort that Tom showed, as I mentioned, make many assumptions about technology development, economics, competition of gas, for example, is a big competitor with nuclear. If gas stays below $5 a million BTUs, which it is currently, nuclear is not competitive. Much better to build gas plants. So, you have to make projections about that. You have to make projections about licensing procedures and so on. Technically, we have the capability, the world has the capability to deploy more nuclear right now. France is 80% nuclear in its electricity. There's no reason you couldn't see a larger fraction here. It all depends upon policy and economics more than it does on technology.
Made by France 40 years ago?
That's, well, I think in the oil shocks, yes, 35, 40 years ago, correct.
I've actually, in my consulting world, worked a lot in nuclear power plants. I've probably been extensively in 20 different nuclear power plants and feel like it is an important ongoing technology that we should be supporting. I am taken, though, that dealing with some of the vendors for nuclear technologies over the last decade or so, the numbers that they have been able to stand behind have been shocking as to how expensive new nuclear plants will cost. And the recent solicitation in Canada for a new nuclear plant came in at 10 times what the projected vendors were talking about in terms of cost. It was so far out of economic sense. We would be we would be fully utilizing solar everywhere before that nuclear power plant would make economic sense. And I think there's a very real economic question about the viability of fission-based nuclear based on what the vendors are willing to stand behind.
Ruth Hunter, Engineering 64 and GSM 86. What about the disposal of nuclear waste? When is that coming online for DOE?
So the whole waste issue is very complicated, both technically and politically, as you probably well know, right, politically. The president took Yucca Mountain off the table. There is, from a technical point of view, not a great urgency. The NRC has said that the waste can safely stay in dry casks on site or in some interim storage location for many decades. What we will be doing is mounting a program to understand how to recycle, not necessarily reprocess in a Purex or conventional way, and deal with the waste. The technologies are there, if not on the horizon. They need to be developed and demonstrated and so on. And I think, again, assuming consistency of the policy environment, that's a decade-scale task that we'll undertake.
We probably have time for just one more. Oh, you want to go a little longer? Okay, I'm getting the high side. Okay. Go ahead.
Boone Pickens, my name's Howard Schwartz. Boone Pickens notwithstanding, given the competition from biofuels and electric car technology, does natural gas have, you think, a meaningful role to play in the reduction of our oil imports over the next 10 years or so?
You know, for fleets, it makes a good deal of sense. If you go to Europe, you look at taxis, and I think there are fleet applications here. I don't see it as a large-scale passenger car technology. As you said, there are other technologies, whole new infrastructure. Why use the gas for that?
We're still importing significant amounts of oil for power generation in different parts of the country, and I think all of that could be offset with natural gas. It will require significant investment in pipeline infrastructure and so forth, but I think that's a very real win quickly, and economically, I think, even without a GHG benefit, which there is, economically, I think we'll push towards making that happen. But on transportation fuel, you know, there are pockets. Utah has an enormous penetration of natural gas vehicles, but I don't see it as widespread.
Jack Ranger, I live down in Virginia, 88 graduate. I'm going to kind of follow up on that question. I was actually trying to buy a natural gas vehicle last month, and I could find one in New York and have it shipped to me. It's a couple thousand more. I would have got a tax break and everything like that. My problem is filling it up is hard, right? And so that's the challenge. There is a home unit you could buy. Okay, it costs a couple $1,000. It lasts for a couple years, and the company that just made it went out of business and got bought by a European company. So why, instead of cash for clunkers, why didn't we do some sort of, hey, we'll give you a refueling station for free. I'd go out and get the vehicle. I'd create that niche market, and then we'd be off and running. I mean, it's a great fuel. I almost got hit by a bus powered by natural gas this morning on Com Ave. It works.
So in Massachusetts, there's actually, I think, 6 or 8 refueling stations. It's more than most parts of the country, but I wouldn't want to drive it out of state because you might be stuck somewhere and you can get it towed back to where a refueling station is. I think the economics are just not quite there. I mean, there was enormous investments in natural gas vehicles and infrastructure by the Department of Energy a decade or so ago, and you know, some regions really went very extensively in terms of developing it. I don't think there's any primary manufacturer now that stands behind natural gas conversion, so there's secondary companies that will do that. Honda had a natural gas vehicle that was available, but has been pulling it back from the market. So I think it's pretty precarious right now. I think there's better solutions, hopefully, that are around the corner than using natural gas.
Steve.
So, you know, this discussion is a wonderful example of, or illustration, pedagogic movement here, back into professor mode, right? One is the systems nature of this. We can use the gas for power, we can use the gas to make chemicals and fibers, we can use the gas for transportation. Not obvious what the right answer is. That's point one. Second point is, with respect to energy, there are multiple ways to do things, and given enough money and political will, governments can make anything they want happen. Right? The challenge is to understand what the best routes are, right? And it's complicated.
And government seldom picks the right winners.
Hi there, my name is Philippe Content. I'm a student at GSM, but from '89. We are looking at putting a 160 megawatt manufacturing facility in solar panels, thin film. And this is just an anecdote. we applied for a DOE loan guarantee at the cost of $100,000 without any guarantees about getting it. And when we were in the process of applying for it, the senator of one of the states in which we were thinking about putting the plant down called us and said, "You're out of your mind to do that because DOE, for the moment, is totally disorganized, and nobody has ever spent so much money on things that you don't know what the outcome will be." And I had discussions with the people at DOE, and they could never tell me when the guarantee would be in place or what the terms would be, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the people at the state were extremely helpful in moving the project forward. And I thought, does it make sense to have the state DOEs manage a big chunk of that big DOE federal loan guarantee program at the state levels so that we can create the 480 jobs, direct jobs, and I'm not talking about the 1,200 other ones that are the indirect jobs, that go hand in hand with the deployment of such a facility? Yeah, that's a question for you. A gentleman from the DOE.
Yeah, I mean, the DOE is actually investigating that as a very real possibility, and our agency has been, as well as the Mass Clean Energy Center, has been in conversation with DOE, and they've been working on different processes to give delegated lending authority to the states. As I understand, I haven't been involved directly with Parallel, but the USDA, Department of Agriculture, does that with state agricultural offices. I visited with Secretary Chu. I think it was his second week in the office, and he was identifying some of the problems that he was inheriting, and one was the fact that they had this phenomenal loan guarantee program that had been up and running for 5 years. They've gone through all kinds of processes, and they'd gotten exactly $0 out the door to actually guaranteed on projects. Since then, I think 2 or 3 have been put out the door. He also indicated that some staff told him that they thought that maybe it would make sense to not try and to have a floor solicitation. So if you didn't need $500 million, the administrative cost just wasn't worth you applying here, which is just nuts when we think about our kind of problems. And Secretary Chu thought that was nuts. He said that's not the answer. We have to find procedures here that can get this to work better. But there's some real challenges between state and federal folks to figure out how to make this work. So I've got a strong excitement and enthusiasm by the leadership, as you see with Steve and with others in this administration in Washington, that their ideas and their intentions are completely aligned with making a real difference very quickly on these problems. But it's not easy, is the simple statement.
So just to follow up on that, there is some good news. I sit and have sat for the last 4 or 5 months on the board that approves these loans finally, or at least recommends to the secretary that they be approved. And so it's hard to spend tens of billions of dollars quickly and responsibly, okay? And the loans I have seen, I have been incredibly impressed with the diligence of the review, the business case, the financial case, the technical case. And I feel good that we're spending taxpayer money with that care. You hear about some of the big ones, Nissan for electric cars, Ford for a variety of vehicle technologies, solar, wind, and so on. But there's this tension between doing it fast and doing it well, and we're trying to navigate that.
Hi, I'm Brett Feldman. I'm a GSM alum, and I work for Constellation Energy now. First part of my question is to all the panelists. Do you think a federal carbon cap and trade is going to come anytime soon? And then second to Phil, what exactly happens to Reggie once that happens?
All right, federal cap and trade. First, you know that Waxman-Markey has passed through the House. Kerry Boxer, which is a rough analog bill, will be introduced into the Senate on Tuesday. There will certainly be a lot of discussion of all of these things. Whether Congress has enough energy and attention span after health care this year remains to be seen. But, you know, my understanding is that with legislation, it's going to take several times before this happens. But my guess is that there will certainly be a price on carbon put into place sometime in the next couple of years.
I don't have as good a crystal ball, but I actually have a lot of hope that we will actually have legislation this year regarding a cap and trade program, but that's just hope, maybe. RGGI goes away. RGGI goes away by design. RGGI goes away by necessity. Having a region trying to run a cap and trade on a 10-state basis while the nation is running one doesn't make sense. It would be too burdensome to try and make that happen. A real challenge is the states that have been using some of the carbon allowance money for things like energy efficiency needs to be able to continue and even accelerate that. And under some of the discussions that I've seen, some of the plans around where the carbon allowances might go from a national cap and trade type program, it's unclear that there's going to be as significant a role for states in any of that. And that's part of the political challenges that are out there. I'm actually being asked to potentially testify next week on this matter at Congress and the Senate on this. So, you know, I just got an email this morning about where the allocations look like they're going to go right now. It was just released this morning from the committee, and there's some problems there. And so we'll hopefully kind of work it through.
Just a perspective, because I certainly agree that trying to run a regional cap and trade alongside a national one is tough. If I have an appeal to my friend here from the federal government, it is to come up with a system that's easy and predictable. And there seems to be a lot of grist in this for the politicians.
Were it in my power, I'd grant it immediately. All right?
but people can react to anything where they have some visibility about what the cost of carbon is going to be over some reasonable time horizon. And if we can come out with some outcome along those lines, everybody will be able to live with it.
Agreed.
Let's take 2 more questions from the audience.
Hi, my name's Brandon from BU, graduated this year. I guess this is for everybody. Something I thought I'd hear today I haven't heard, hydrogen. I know there's a vision for a hydrogen economy. I know the technology's not there. I know battery and storage technology needs to get there. I assume DuPont hasn't bet on hydrogen. It doesn't sound like it, but just curious what anybody has to say about that. I think it's part of the solution, or has been thought about as part of the solution. As you say, there's no silver bullet.
So certainly hydrogen in terms of the ultimate and clean energy is hard to argue with. And in fact, it was the subject of some discussion that we had during our lunch before the panel. I would say from my own standpoint, we have invested in proton exchange membrane fuel cells, where hydrogen is in fact the fuel. The issue you run into, for me, is the practical one of hydrogen production and hydrogen distribution. You're dealing with a material at cryogenic temperatures. The energy density you can achieve, unless you can come up with some high density way to store the energy in the form of hydrogen, some carbon nanotube type absorption, or some technique that's low cost and allows you to store the hydrogen, it's kind of hard to get there. And I think, unlike solar panels, where when you have the panel, you stick it under the sun and power starts to flow, your fuel cell vehicle based on hydrogen, if you can't find that hydrogen station every 100 miles, the car isn't going to do you much good. So I think the infrastructure issues are what ultimately will hold us back on moving forward with the hydrogen economy. It may happen someday, but it will be more than decades away.
So again, multiple transport futures, and the challenge is to find the right one. Just a general remark, if and when we can reduce our fossil fuel use for transport, oil, significantly, we're still going to have to find that energy somewhere else. Right? This is a question of how you make the hydrogen. So for example, not on the hydrogen side, but on the electric side, if we can convert all of the passenger cars into battery-operated vehicles, that's great, but we have to make about 40% more electricity than we're making now because you gave up the energy in the petroleum. And that has severe implications for the grid, for what kind of generating capacity we need, and so on.
Hi, my name is Nina, and I am a student here at Boston University. I want to thank the panelists for being here today, sharing with us your thoughts and your experience in dealing with all these issues. The question I have actually stems from about 5 seconds of sound bites I heard coming here in my car, listening to NPR. And maybe this is a question specifically for Commissioner Phillip, is that what I heard was that as an alternative to, let's say for instance, with getting consumers to install energy efficient light bulbs, it took us years and all these incentives which no one really understood. And an alternative that was proposed on the radio was to build it into, I think, the property taxes, and that would include solar panels and all these other things I don't really understand. But the idea is to alleviate the burden to the original installer, the person up front that's installing all this. How does that sound as a consumer incentive, whether that's viable and possibly legislatable?
Yeah, the challenge of moving forward on the energy efficiency side of the energy challenge that we're facing is, the amazing part about it is so much of it isn't about the money. There are other things that are broken that we're not doing that. Awareness, education, what are the options, the better options, and so forth. The split incentives, the life cycle cost of these things. We get all worked up over the initial cost, but we don't really look at what the long-term implications of all of this are. There are many tools and mechanisms that we have at our disposal to deal with the financing side of these problems that we haven't fully utilized because we actually don't have the delivery channels established to really deliver the goods on these matters. In Massachusetts, one of the parts of the Green Communities Act is exactly on-bill financing opportunities so that long-term financing can be brought to bear to bring down the initial cost for installing these energy efficiency devices. We are, for the first time, baking into the plans that the utilities are putting forth. So we will be spending something like $500 or $600 million on energy efficiency programs in 2012, according to the plans that we've got in front of us now. And this will be 3 times the level that anywhere in the country is spending on a per capita basis. A quarter of that money is being targeted to come with yet to be determined financing from kind of other people's money, be it on bill, be it from a property tax standpoint. And we've looked at a whole bunch of the different options here, and I think that there are ways that we're going to be able to move forward with this very quickly to take that lever, that problem out of the way, that barrier to make this happen. But we really have to build up all those delivery channels to have, instead of 50 people in the state, which is what we had a year or two ago, 50 people who could go inside people's homes and tell them how they're wasting their energy in their homes right now, to hundreds of people are out there not only being able to diagnose and tell them what they need to do, but actually help them fix it, and fix it in a real easy way so that it's not a burden on the homeowner. And there's tremendous levers that we have available to us. Right now we have, I think in the state of Massachusetts, about 20% of the lighting in the state of Massachusetts that could be used, compact fluorescent lights, have compact fluorescent lights in them. 80% don't have compact fluorescent lights. And it's less than a 6-month payback for people to switch out from those incandescents to compact fluorescents. And they last 5 years, 7 years, depending on how you're actually using that lighting. I mean, so the economic side of this equation isn't even the biggest challenge. It is a challenge. We have to deal with it. We've got some programs in place and some thoughts about dealing with it. But we really have to move forward with changing consumer behaviors on many other fronts and awareness about this. And we're actually going to be launching next year a lot of different pilots to help bring awareness and insight and possibilities to folks who right now don't realize there's any choices about their energy consumption.
Well, we are unfortunately running out of time. We have a very regimented schedule for our alumni who have to make it to their next class. So please let me conclude this panel by thanking our 3 panelists for sharing their insights and experience with us. This was a truly remarkable event, and we are lucky to have had the opportunity to hear from such a distinguished group. And even more importantly, we feel lucky that the 3 of them are in leadership positions and are involved in defining the paths in basic and applied science, as well as policy, for addressing arguably one of the most important and complex problems humanity has faced in recent times. I also want to thank Bob for initiating and sponsoring this panel. And I want to especially thank you, our alumni, friends, colleagues, and students for taking the time to be with us on this typical October Boston afternoon. The one main reason I moved to New England. In any case, to our alumni, have fun with the continuing alumni events, and to the rest of you, have a pleasant and dry afternoon. Thank you.